Well, it gives me great honour actually to be chairing this first session. I'm going to introduce very briefly the three speakers, and they are then going to introduce themselves in terms of their relationship to this topic, and then kick off with a bit of a provocation, something to think about whilst we continue the conversation this morning, and perhaps for the rest of the day. So I'm going to start by handing the microphone over to, actually, can you use that microphone? To Tamsin Silvery, who is actually the Culture Programme Curator at Historic England. And we've worked with Tamsin previously and Historic England previously over a number of years. They've been a great partner to the gallery. And perhaps, Tamsin, you could talk a little bit about your history in terms of working with this area.
Yeah, sure. Hi. What was that one? Can you hear me? Is that better? Yeah, that's better. So yeah, I am a Culture Programme Curator at Historic England, but before that I used to manage the Prix Pictet, which is the Contemporary Photography Prize, and I did that for about 8 years, and I saw sort of a lot of different types of conflict photography. That kind of got me interested in the subject, which I then ended up by doing a PhD in, looking at how conflict photographs are curated in different contexts, so sort of art galleries, history museums, and specifically the kind of British context, so publicly funded institutions from 2010 to 2020, which, as many of you will know, is quite a kind of specific political time as well in terms of government policy. And I'll go into that a bit later. And during that time, I was also have been working at Historic England, where I collaborated on an exhibition. That way, perfect. With Imperial War Museum, which you can just see here. We can talk about this later, but yeah, I've sort of been involved in conflict photography as a curator, but also as a kind of thinker and working with photographers directly. I sort of wanted to kick off with a kind of question about how and why do we exhibit conflict photographs in museums and galleries? Like, why is this happening? And there definitely seems to be a big trend in that. That since, I think probably since 9/11, there's been like a kind of growing in pace of conflict photographs taking up space in institutions, public institutions. And the reason I put up this slide is because, as you can see in the first circled red sort of title, that says museum curator on it. And this is a index that was polled across this country about what the positions that people trust. And in 2020, and I should probably say this is before the incidents of theft at the British Museum, so it might be very different now. But at this point in 2020, museum curators were added to this as a kind of profession, which sort of seems extraordinary. And also they rank really highly in terms of trust, so trusted to tell the truth, and that's really important. And the circle at the bottom is journalists, government ministers, and politicians generally. And I think this is important as to why images are in these spaces, because galleries and museums are seen as kind of trusted sites, places where the truth is told, whereas these other sources, like the political sphere, are not. And so therefore, these spaces are becoming kind of increasingly important environments for kind of public discussion about what we're seeing, what is truthful imagery, what stories are they telling. And just by way of a second provocation, I was thinking about how the effect of different types of institutions. So I think this is a very easy kind of example, because these are two exhibitions of the same photographer, Don McCullin, at Imperial War Museum in 2010 and Tate in 2020. And as you can see from the kind of even like these exhibition posters, that the photographs are treated very differently, they're curated very differently. And I think what's really important to kind of note about this is the different curatorial framings, and it'll be great to hear about how you've approached this show, because as you can see from these sort of thresholds, the IWM, which is the dark space, they're really putting Don McCullin right at the centre of this exhibition. So it's about him, how he has been shaped by war as a kind of news media correspondent. By 2020, the photograph that's used is a photograph of a British subject, so that's Concert in County Durham. The Tate are positioning him as an artist, a British artist in the canon of British artists at the home of British art. And just to kind of like unpick this a bit more, both of these exhibitions started off with this quote, those introductory texts. And I think the kind of important thing is that McCullin wants you to feel, but how can you feel if you don't understand. So I think the curation is so important about what are you made to understand. And just very quickly, in this space, which is Imperial War Museum, they're making you understand about the kind of different media actors that affect this. So you've got examples from magazines, you've got colour photography, sort of his helmet, things that kind of locate him in the field, big blow up the Sunday Times magazine cover. At the Tate, you've got a kind of very traditional modern art gallery aesthetic. The images are small, they're all at eye height, they're all designed to be looked independently. And these are kind of strategies that support the curatorial vision and the mission of the organisation. And that is kind of, I think that's a useful departure point from where we can go.
Brilliant introduction and overview in terms of museums and galleries. I'm now going to ask Dr. Vicar Bavagina, I should say, to introduce herself. We were laughing about this earlier. Do we use a doctor or not? Tamsin is also a doctor. Just to say, the Vicar is an associate curator of Open Eyes, been working with us for the last 3 years. She's also a research fellow currently at Edinburgh University, and she's a co-founder of Ukrainian Photographies. Over to you, Vicar.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, now I'm working in academia, so everyone said that I need to use my doctor status as much as possible. So, as Sarah said, I have been working with OpenEye over 3 years, and our partnership started after the full-scale invasion, when Max and I started to work on archive and website on Ukrainian photography in English, because there is still a lack of English versions of researchers' articles about Ukrainian photography. So we started this website archive, and OpenEye supported us. Thank you very much for this. And we invited our friends and colleagues to write some articles about Ukrainian photographers. And we're trying to reboot this website now to give a new life for it. And for the last 5 months, I have been working as a fellow researcher at University of Edinburgh, and I'm researching Russian colonialism and imperialism, and how it influenced cultures, identities of its post-Soviet and post-imperialistic countries, and how Russian imperialism shaped the gaze for Western researchers to see and to research these countries, this region. Thank you, Jasmine. You raised really fundamental question about war photography, and unfortunately, war photography became incredibly relevant in last years, and I think not like for me as a Ukrainian, but also for everyone who see what's going on in the world. Because of this political system that now everywhere, these political regimes that became almost everywhere now, who put this idea that there is no truth and that the power is the main force now and the main idea now. But I hope this symposium became a stage for people who have been working with war photography and the people who care about the subject, just to talk about these very relevant ideas about war photography. And my key points will be much more narrow than this means. I want to talk about responsibility of institutions, of organizations who presented, who popularize war photography. And is there any responsibility, and what type of responsibility should be, what we can ask and wait from this organization? Because we understand that culture and art organization have some influence, have some public power. They shape some ideas, they highlight ideas, contexts, and so, of course, there should be, on my personal opinion, some responsibility. And for example, I want to talk about recent World Press Photo nominations. I'm sure a lot of you heard about it. And in Ukraine, we heard about it a lot. It was a huge discussion. One of the images that you see here, presentation for the winners. For the presentation, World Press Photo jury choose a duo. They make a duo of images. And one of the images is photo by Muslim photographer Nana Heitman, which was commissioned by New York Times for the huge article about training camp in Chechnya. And this huge story that was written by journalist Neil McFarker, and he wrote a great story about background of Chechnya, about its imperialistic context and influence from Russia, and how these newly became soldiers went from Chechnya to Donetsk region, to Ukraine. And so photos of Nana Heitman is, there is a soldier in a hospital, underground hospital. And these wounded soldiers, yes, surrounded by medical workers. And World Press Photo was making a decision about this short list, about pairing these two images with another photo by German photographer Florian Bachmeier. In the image, you can see a small girl, Angelina. She is like only 6 years old. She's from a small village from Kharkiv region, and she suffers from panic attacks and other mental issues because of the war and because her village was sheltered many times. So as a result of numerous publications in the media and letters to World Press Photo, World Press Photo gave a huge comment and apologized for sharing this, for pairing these two images. And after World Press Photo apologized, New York Times also made a huge comment and changed the article, because before they said that this wounded soldier was a Russian, and then they make a change that this wounded soldier was originally Ukrainian, who was from Lugansk region that's occupied from 2014, and he was forced to go to the war on the Russian side. And there's also another winner of World Press Photo contest. This anti-Russian protest in Sakartvelo that you mainly know as Georgia, because also from Russian propaganda and from Russian imperialistic ideology. So Mikhail Tereshenko is a journalist, staff journalist of TASS. It's a government Russia media agency. I think the biggest media tool for propaganda in Russia. And he showed a photo of protest in Sakartvelo in 2024. So with these two examples, I just want to raise a question about responsibility of this organization who works with photography. And should we see war photography and conflict photography just a visual image without any context or lack of context, or we should dig deeper to backgrounds to see the wider story, to see the people's story, and just not to see this history that written by huge countries for little one countries. Yeah, thank you.
I'm just going to come in on that because Tamsin was, go back to Tamsin for a second, and perhaps you could talk a little bit about that photography voice, particularly I'm thinking of Polly Brandon and...
Can we, sorry.
Do you want to go back to the...
Yeah. Oh, there we go. If you go. Yeah, this is, these are kind of two examples of quite quick exhibition responses, relatively quick exhibition responses to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. One at the Imperial War Museum and one at Polly Braden at the Founding Museum in London. And I think the Anastasia Taylor-Lynn's work from the front line is obviously kind of more akin to the World Press Photo stuff that you've just shown, and these sort of images of action, and therefore carry the sort of burden of like that specificity that you kind of need to know what's going on. Whereas I think with Polly Braden, that's a really interesting approach where she was commissioned by the Founding Museum to kind of spend time with young people, young girls in particular that had ended up in Britain and were kind of making a new life here. And I think these are great examples of how you can have a more kind of co-created, socially engaged approach about creating sort of new war photographs, if you take that term to be a really expansive term, which I think is helpful, and show a different perspective on it away from these sort of iconic, I know that's going to be a Labour term all throughout the day, images that actually allows you to kind of see the consequences of war that are not so sort of indexical. You can't necessarily read them in the photographs. You need to kind of have that explanation, you need to have a kind of space to understand what these photographs are of. And I think also really important to you is spaces like Open Eye Gallery, where socially engaged practice is so important about spending time with communities, making photographs together that the subjects have agreed to, which is obviously not necessarily possible when you are kind of photographing in a battle zone. And obviously that's got a whole load of things that should be discussed later around kind of the consent of that. But yeah, I think these are nice examples for that.
That's, I mean, it brings me to Max now, who actually, as you may know, Max and Victor curated the Ukrainian Pavilion at Venice Biennale last year, and one of the premises for that was the engagement of real people in the creation of the work, of all of the works, the different artists that they worked with, and that kind of sense of voice. But there was another question that came up around that Max is going to sort of look at and address around aesthetics. So I'll hand over to you, Max, and perhaps say a little bit about home and some of the other. Yeah.
Hello again. Thanks, Sarah. So I'm a curator here at OpenEye, but over the last 3 years, of course, I had to work with war photography quite a lot because of Russian invasion of Ukraine and other projects we worked on. And I always have these questions, maybe more question to myself as a curator and the institutions I work with about the aesthetical dimension of these stories. So if we work with war photography and we seek to provoke discussion and reflection, if we seek to inform or maybe even evoke the empathy, why we so often are focusing on the aesthetic qualities of the picture, even maybe if they are not necessary support these aims. And I think with war photography, it's a very special case because there are very different approaches to exhibiting it, and they are extremes. So on one hand, you can see the photojournalistic displays which approach the subject in a more direct way. On the other hand, you can have contemporary art exhibitions which use photography to what's being said, like look askance at the war, at the subject, not directly, but in these both modes of exhibiting photography, they assume certain aesthetical conventions and assumed effects of these shows, but I'm always questioning myself and in general how these different strategies are engaging with the subject really. How successful are they? And as an example from very recent work in OpenEye, 2 years ago we commissioned Ukrainian photographer Nazar Furik to go to the south of Ukraine and photograph the consequences of destruction of Kakhovka Dam. It was for the Climate Lab exhibition, in which we look at climate and environment. So we wanted Nazar to photograph the consequences of this huge environmental disaster. So the Russian troops there was an explosion, and maybe you heard about this. It was quite a long time ago, but it's one of the biggest dams in Europe, I think, the biggest in Ukraine. So it caused significant change in environment, in ecology in the region. Of course, the whole of Kherson was underwater for some time. And so Nazar created a very beautiful series of photographs using his signature color and composition. Sometimes you can really see it's very consistent with what he did before. But he spent a very long time there in the region, and he volunteered himself. He worked with the volunteers he knew, so he was not a photographer who just came for one day to capture the most obvious things. He really knew the subject. He knew the area. But the photographs he created, now I think, I'm actually not sure, it's more of a question. Are they too aesthetically pleasing? And were we as a gallery, as a photography gallery, offering our audience good photography to satisfy their expectations? Maybe when they come to photography gallery, and maybe if what was I trying to satisfy my expectations as a curator? And just to expand this thought, because this is what's always called, sometimes called late photography, so photography of consequences of atrocity. But in this particular case, there are no direct indexical traces, mechanical, chemical on these photographs of what is being depicted on these photographs. The way around, there's a color profile added post factum on top of this image taken. So my question is, what does it tell us about the intention of the photographer? What does it tell us about the intention of curators and galleries and museums when showing photographs as aesthetic objects, but at the same time as meaningful presentations of war?
Yeah, and that brings us to this very poignant questions about galleries and aesthetics and the tradition of galleries and the way in which they present. And I think, Tamsin, I'm interested, and you raised a question actually when we were talking earlier about how temporary exhibitions work, but I'm particularly interested because you worked on a temporary exhibition which was dealing with the kind of the retrospective looking back at conflict. It would and you know, obviously included from the images that you put, an incredible sort of sense of that aesthetic and how that works, and that relationship between the aesthetic and our sense of value, our cultural value that sits with that. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that exhibition and.
Right at the beginning. Sorry. Always. That one. Yeah, I can talk about that. I do think aesthetics are justified, and I think they, both within the exhibition making and image making, and I think we need a spectrum of images. I think, you know, some of the amazing photographs here that obviously work in news content don't work in other spaces, and I think as far as I'm concerned, the more you can get people to engage with these subjects, the better. And, you know, part of people's sort of anxiety around engaging with these subjects is because they don't understand, and exhibitions can be great spaces for that, which brings me to this. So this was an exhibition on the kind of destruction of cultural heritage during war. There's a really horrible example of that upstairs with forensic architecture in terms of the TV tower being, which is a registered monument, being destroyed. And this has been going on, you know, for as long as war has been going on. So this exhibition at the Imperial War Museum looked at that, and as you can see from the photograph on the right, we use photographs from Historic England's archive showing like the destruction of places during the Second World War. We also looked at kind of more current conflicts and sort of created this slightly immersive experiential walkway into the exhibition that you can see here. So you're kind of surrounded by this sense of a ruin, of kind of a ruined landscape, but actually different times, different conflicts, and to kind of show how war sort of levels it, and this has been going on for a really long time. And then the photograph on the left actually shows the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. So this is destruction by ISIS of this monument. And I think what was really interesting about this exhibition is that we were able to bring both sort of relatively live or recent conflict into the space with historic imagery as well. And to use the space and the context of the Imperial War Museum to kind of make the case around heritage protection being really important now. I mean, when you, as some of you may know, in the Imperial War Museum in London, to get to this gallery, you have to walk through a massive atrium which has got bombs, destroyed vehicles. You know, your kind of sensory experience of getting to this space is already immersed you in war, and then you have a kind of space that you can kind of get people to pause and think about a subject in greater depth. I think we really like thought about how this was displayed, and as again you'll be aware, there are trends in exhibition making. This is very much the trend where you had sort of see-through walls, so you could kind of see what was coming, but you kind of play with that sense of the built space, because these photographs register destruction in the built environment, which is what Historic England's remit is as well. So yeah, is that enough? Have I covered?
Yeah, I mean, so that for you, that kind of justification of the use of aesthetics as a way of people engaging over time,
Yeah.
spending time with, and yes. Can I ask about the contextual information on this show? How did you, in terms of the text itself, just
Yeah. So working with the Imperial War Museum is a specific context. They are they're known to be the kind of leading cultural authority on conflicts. So each of these images, for example, had a really clear label which said where it was of, when it was taken, very kind of clear context. And then with things like the Bamiyan Buddha destruction, sort of context about the more recent wars, it's really hard to do. You've got 100 words in a label caption. This is really hard to do. But in a space like this, interpretation is given a lot of weight, and that is organisationally their policy. That's what they have to do. I think looking at other exhibitions, like the difference between the interpretation at Tate's and Imperial War Museum of Don McCullen's work, art galleries can get away with doing less and giving less kind of local specificity. And I think this is something that you both touched on. I think it's really important. And what's also really important with these images and all of the images that we're sitting amongst, they don't tell you what they are. Like in 10 years time, 20 years time, we won't know what these things are. Unless you're a military historian, you can unpick what type of uniform people are wearing. You understand the context of production. It's really important to understand the context of production, the context of what the conflict was. Imperial War Museum does that as its bread and butter. When the images like this are shown in different spaces, they don't necessarily get the same level of treatment, and that kind of doesn't mean that they are not effective or they don't sort of inspire empathy, but actually what you understand is different. And yeah, in this it was very historically rooted.
which brings me nicely to ask the two of you around curating exhibitions which are looking at live war contexts, so things that are actually happening now don't necessarily have that kind of weight of years, and how you came about deciding what you might do with this exhibition.
Can you hear me?
I should mention that we are in this gallery space surrounded by the photographs from The Guardian, and The Guardian was our major partner in this exhibition, and Fiona is here. Thank you so much, Fiona, for all your work you put into this show. And our idea was basically what Jasmine was saying, that we wanted to expand this experience of looking at photographs and have the exact full title for the caption, the QR code so you can go to the original article and you can go through other images, you can read the article, because I agree, no matter how strong a photograph is, I think it can be very moving. It can work on this level of evoking some response, and maybe this is good enough so you can start to want to engage with this subject more. But in order to understand what you're looking at, you need to have quite a lot of information and context. So this is why we wanted to represent the way conflict photography works in the media, particularly how it works in The Guardian. And I think it's always, especially for the ongoing conflict, when many things are not, so when dust has not settled yet, and maybe many things are just ongoing, and they are not clear, and from different sides coming different information. So as much information you have, as much information you can get from the photographer, or even community he or she works with the best.
Yeah, I'll just come back briefly because you've done 3 different rooms. I know with this room, particularly the younger generation, talking to people that have been visiting this room, they've been looking at the QR codes and they've been reading Guardian articles. Some of them, I would imagine, aren't necessarily engaged with the broadsheets as a matter of course. So I think it's been very interesting looking at how people respond to the different rooms. Victor, could you just quickly touch on 2 and 3, gallery 2 and 3, because they're very different approaches. Just
Yeah, in this exhibition, we tried to collect as more different approaches to war photography as possible that will fit in the gallery. So if in the gallery 1 here, as Max said, we're looking at like journalistic photography that document everyday events and try to give you more information as possible. So gallery 2 is 2 projects for Magnum photographers who are doing like long-term documentary projects, spending with their subject as more time as they could, just to present more broader picture. And the gallery 3, we decided to go with maybe more inconvenient approach to war photography, to war images. And there is 2 projects. One of them is project about Kiev TV Tower that was bombed by Russian army 2 years ago. And it's huge project with different layers, with historical layer, media layer, and a lot of backgrounds. How history could continue itself, history of violence. And second project is not photo, it's video, but it's like looking at still image, and it's about perception of will be really clear perception of dead bodies in the media, and how we also need context when we see on the dead body of the soldier, because we should understand who if this person was someone who came to a land to occupy this land, to kill people, or someone who trying just to keep their land and to help people survive.
brilliant. And I think, in the different approaches, as Vic says, we don't have huge institutions like the Tate, but in the different approaches, I think much of that comes out of the thinking that came from previous shows that we've done. And Max and Vic kind of questioning themselves and asking these additional questions, which I'm hoping we may now be able to open it up to the floor for your questions. Please feel free to make them related to the exhibition and what's been spoken, but if there's any questions that people have that are kind of more general around museums and galleries, we're very open to that as well. So we have a question from I'm actually
asking
wondering
without the mic.
whether you
Yeah.
Sorry.
could you introduce yourself as well?
Oh, sorry. Yes, of course. My name is Tom Alderson. I'm an academic based at Cardiff University with an interest in the history of photojournalism, including war photography, but also post-conflict imagery. I wanted to ask about the title, No Iconic Images. It's a brilliantly provocative title. It suggests, for a start, there aren't any, and also implies that you don't want them. So I would like to hear your reflections on this question of managing the expectation of iconic imagery, or the demand for iconic imagery, or Tamsin, when dealing with exhibitions of historic imagery, how you negotiate the challenge of displaying or not displaying iconic images.
Brilliant. And did everybody hear that? So we're really looking at iconic images, and perhaps we could start.
We spent a long time thinking about the title, and almost in every article about war photography, you hear about this particular iconic image, iconic photograph to change something. might be true. There are, talking about Don McCullin, this is definitely an iconic image and a very important one. And there are iconic images in this exhibition, we think. For example, Evgeny Maladetka, who is present here today, his photograph was on all the covers of all major news outlets. So it's probably an iconic image. So not that we trying to say we don't need any iconic images, maybe we don't even have control over image becoming iconic or not. And no one decides it. It's just how the importance of it grows, maybe if the aesthetic qualities again of it, if it can represent the whole story with one particular photograph, maybe not representing it in any just one aspect of the story. Anyway, it can become iconic. But so we wanted maybe just to hang this question: how the images of war operate, why they become iconic, what do they change? Do we believe in what we see? How can we really relate to them if we don't have much information, or what information do we need to have? So this exhibition is more like an attempt to answer this question, which is a very broad question, of course.
I just add a few words that for me, this title became more relevant after the meeting in Oval Cabinet between Zelensky and Trump. Sorry, I'm again about Ukraine, but I'm really biased. And when I saw what was going on there, I saw that we all know these iconic images after World War II. And in some point, these iconic images build this aura of huge states, US and Russia, as people who fight against Nazi, who save the world. And now it's not true, it's not relevant anymore. But again and again, the states, especially Russia, using these iconic images and this idea of savers again and again. Even now, they doing horrible things. They use these images as an evidence of their truth, of what they did like decades ago.
In terms of kind of looking at, I've got them here. Yeah, photographs of obviously like historically kind of looking at iconic images. This obviously Shell Shock Marine by Don McCullin is kind of one of the very well known. I think you can treat them really differently. I don't think they can be. I mean, I think for example, with this, you've got this massive photograph of the Shell Shock Marine, and it's literally treated like an icon. It's big, it's staring at you down the space. But actually, if you kind of think about it, look at it a bit closer, they put the vitrine with the helmet in front of it, which sort of echoes the Marine's helmet, and then the image on the left, the photograph you can see of somebody wearing a helmet is Don McCullin himself. So they've kind of triangulated this sort of sense of McCullin as a photographer, the Marine and what he's experienced, and you can draw a parallel between McCullin's kind of PTSD and then the helmet, so it kind of embodies it. And actually, I think this, and this tiny reference print is right next to it. It's just behind the corner of that vitrine, which is really extraordinary because this has got these printing notes on it. So for somebody else to print, like make this darker, make this lighter. And I actually think that this completely undermines the iconicity of that image in that space, because you're kind of saying like this was in news media circulation, and that is a curatorial act. That is the curators saying, let's put all this together and show that this. And actually, when in the book that accompanies the IWM exhibition, McCullin did an oral history and sort of said he didn't pick this when he did the edit from Vietnam. He didn't pick this image. He left this on the cutting room floor, and it was the editors that, when they reviewed the contact sheets, we'll have that. And then at the Tate, it's quite hard to see, but there's I don't know it's just behind him here. So there's the Marine is on the wall to the right. It's right in the middle. There's just a tiny bit more space around it, which kind of is the Tate saying this is iconic, but at a completely different register. It's also printed a bit bigger. You can see the borders are smaller on that print, and that kind of makes it iconic in a different way. And in this show, the text really laboured the fact that all of these photographs are hand printed by McCullin, so very different from sort of showing the media environment. So I think icons are important. What you do with them is almost more important when you're looking at it retrospectively.
Yes, that's brilliant. And any other questions from the floor or follow-up comments?
I'm John Osborne. I'm just an amateur photographer, observer of the work people like yourselves do. I went to the 2010 exhibition at the Museum, and what struck me there was the way that things changed after the Vietnam War in terms of accessibility to the field of war. Particularly that Margaret Thatcher made sure that images from the Falklands War were very heavily controlled. I wondered whether that continues to be the case, that there's a lot of censorship about what's available to you curators and so on, and to the press, or whether things have reverted a little bit more to what we might expect, truth from the journalists rather than the politicians.
So that was a question about truth and the management of truth post the Vietnam War and in more contemporary circumstances. What interventions may be there in terms of political or other interventions. I wonder if you would like to.
Unfortunately, I think I don't really know the answer to this question as curator, because we don't often confront any form of political intervention in what we do. But I think the next panel with Fiona Shields, the head of photography for The Guardian, this question will be really relevant, and with Evgeny and Peter, later photographers who worked on many conflicts in different capacities, they can answer this properly, because as an observer more, I think it really depends on the particular conflict, because
Can I just? I'm not being good here. But when we were showing Home in Parliament, a different exhibition that these guys had done, there was a question about whether we could show any dead bodies within. So we were in the main atrium within Parliament. Can we or can we not show dead bodies that was coming actually from the curator within Parliament? And I think just to be fair to her, what she was actually saying was that the conversations, because this was a public space in which MPs brought various groups of people, including families, etc., was what she was saying to us was, if you do, the conversation will be about should we have dead bodies rather than the actual exhibition itself and what the exhibition was trying to say. This was coming from her. But so I do think that when we were doing this, I'm just saying, when we were having a private conversation about this exhibition, after, if you wish to show dead bodies in our gallery, absolutely that is a possibility, and you chose to show the images that you chose. So I do think that experience of context and whether there are voices actually that are managing. I don't know.
I think you're right. I even forgot about this case, to be honest, because you think of it as something obvious, so you need to consider the specificity of the venue or the audience. Even here, I mean, you can always make a decision of show the most graphic photographs, and maybe it will work in the opposite way. So people just will turn away because they are too intense, and because even in this gallery, the selection it could have been more graphic maybe, but people sometimes, from what I observed, they are not everyone is willing to spend much time in this environment, engaging with so many different conflicts. So I think it's always maybe not political, but more ethical and situational decision on what you show and how, from curatorial perspective at least.
I think we actually need to leave it there. I've run over, and so I've been the worst moderator in the universe in my own space, running over time. So I think we now move into coffee break. Yep.